Well, some people say the Earth just looks old. Well, it does. To some people, examining carefully, we find maybe a different answer. Let's take a look at K31.htm. That's the file we're in on creationism versus evolution. The Earth just looks old. We're under the section here, way up here. Unprecedented sedimentary activity points to a worldwide flood. If it's a worldwide flood, the Earth is young. But Dr. Don R. Patton starts off with, people say that the Earth just looks old. When you see all of these bedded geological structures, and everybody knows that it takes millions and millions of years to form the fossils in all of those layers, really? And so it has to be old. But invariably, we will find that all those geologic processes are extremely rapid in spite of what's taught in many of the textbooks. For example, the standard for how long it takes to form limestone is 2,700 years to form a foot of limestone back in the so-called Paleozoic age, and at least 2,400 years back in the so-called Cenozoic. And so if that's the case, and we've got many thousands of feet of limestone, then obviously the Earth is very old. But where do these conclusions come from? Obviously no one watched for 2,700 years to see a foot of limestone form, yet people will declare that as if that's what happened. And what we actually find is that this is based on the first assumption that the Earth is old. Assuming the age of a particular formation, then they divide the age into the rocks. Then they come up with so many feet per thousands of years. And so it is the assumption that determines the rate, the sedimentation rate, not personal observation. Now we look at the strata, he says. And those who study stratigraphy know that it has to be formed slowly. The rocks look like they took that long to form. No, that's really the opposite of the truth. Consider the statement in the book, Principles of Stratigraphy. Can't say it. Stratigraphy. Sorry about that. By Dunbar and Rogers. First time in the morning, a little groggy. One of the leading textbooks used in colleges across the country to study stratigraphy, or the strata and the layers. I left the R out there, it threw me off. Use of the lead-uranium ratio, however, soon demonstrated its age to be more than 2 million years old. 2,000 million years, wow. And that's based on the assumption previously discussed. Is that what they expected? No, Dunbar and Rogers cite, to some thoughtful stratigraphers, this amazing discovery presented a dilemma, for if the known stratified rocks have been accumulating throughout this vast span of time, the average rate of deposition must have been extremely slow, yet there is very good evidence that individual beds accumulated rapidly. He goes on to give some examples, and one that we would use to illustrate would be the fossil of the fish, actually in the process of eating his supper, another fish. Now these are species that we can identify and virtually cannot distinguish from modern species. But here in the process of eating supper, we've got a fish eating fish. Now when you look back at that and try to imagine it forming at the rate of 2,700 years per foot, I think you can see that's absurd. I know some people who take a long time to eat supper, but 2,700 years to get covered up like that, this would be ridiculous. So the fish was actually caught in a flow of water, quickly drowned it, and fossilized it in a moment. This indicates that this formed rapidly. Thus Schuhart found that if a geologic common were built up by superposing the thickest known part of each of the geologic systems in North America from Cambrian to the present, Cambrian is the lowest, the composite record would be about 259,000 feet thick. If we combine his results with the latest estimates of time based on radioactive minerals, we get the figures in Table 5, which I guess is going to be below, in which the last column indicates the estimated average of deposition. Abundant fossil shells likewise indicate rapid burial, for if shells are long exposed on the seafloor, they suffer abrasion or corrosion and are overgrown by sessile organisms or performed by boring animals, perforated. At the rate of deposition postulated by Schuhert, 1,000 years, more or less, would have been required to bury a shell 5 inches in diameter. With very local exceptions, fossil shells show no evidence of such long exposure. So you look at the strata, and you look at the fossils in it, and you see indications of rapidity. For example, we look at the fossil fern, and we notice the minute detail. This fossil hasn't even had time to wilt. How long does it take a fern to wilt? Obviously, this rock formed rapidly, even before the fern wilted. We look at the dragonfly encased in the limestone, and the minute detail is obvious. The three-dimensional effect and the salt parts of the body were preserved. When you see very minute creatures with detail preserved in limestone, then it is obvious these things can't happen slowly. Dr. Patton said he was speaking to a high school group not long ago, not too long, and I raised the question, how do fossils form? And one of the fellows stood up in the back and said, well, a fish dies, or a shrimp, he falls to the bottom of the ocean, and over millions of years a rock grows around them. And I smiled and thought a minute, how many of you ever seen a rock grow? Well, rocks don't grow, they deteriorate. We see them coming apart, don't we? And obviously, when we see animals like this, preserved in the limestone, it is impossible to conceive of this kind of fossil not forming rapidly. We just think about it. Wives put shrimp in the refrigerator and they'll say they'll stay there for 30 or 40 years? No, we know better than that. Maybe a day or two, or a week, or you're in trouble, aren't you? And yet this fossil is preserved perfectly and beautifully in the limestone. And we see abundant evidence of that. The mosquito preserved in the limestone. What would do that? Limestone forming at 2,700 years a foot? Don't think so. Or something like concrete hardening basically overnight would have to be the explanation for something like this, wouldn't it? There's absolutely no way to explain it otherwise. The evidence of the strata is of rapid burial. Looking again to the book Principles of Stratigraphy by Dunbar and Rogers, they say internal evidence in the strata, however, belies these estimates. That is the long thousands of years that people project. Now, they believe it took that long. They do, these authors. But they say, you look at the evidence, and he says that it really doesn't go together. In the coal measures of Nova Scotia, for example, the stumps and trunks of many trees are preserved, standing upright as they grew, clearly having been buried before they had time to fall or rot away. Here, sediment certainly accumulated to a depth of many feet within a few years. In other formations were articulated, that is, assembled, skeletons of large animals are preserved. The sediment must have covered them within a few days at the most. He goes on to say, we have beautifully preserved dinosaurs that are very, very large. Some of them even have their soft parts and their skin preserved. We see in some places in Argentina where large ground sloths are preserved, much of the soft material likewise preserved. And they're the size of small elephants. Now this thing lays down and dies at the rate of 2,700 years per foot. What's going to happen to that creature? Well, obviously it's not going to be preserved as we see it in the strata. What we see there, if we stop and think about it, we says obviously that this had to happen fast. There is no way to imagine it happening otherwise. Consider the Ichthyosaurus, about 30 feet long. Now this is a large creature, and he is beautifully preserved in detail. Some of them so much so that if we'll look closely at the internal evidence, we can actually see the embryo, the small Ichthyosaurus, inside the mother. And in one of the fossils that's in the museum in Berlin, that birth process where the youngster is born, the youngster born lives, is seen in processes preserved in the limestone. Is it conceivable that you could do this at the rate of even 1,000 years a foot? It's just absolutely impossible. The quotation referring to the tree standing upright in the sediment. Here is one of the illustrations that accompanied an article in Scientific American several years ago. The tree was 43 feet high, with hundreds of layers surrounding it, just as well preserved at the top as at the bottom. Now, you can look at that and imagine 2,700 years a foot. And in another illustration in a similar article, we see 50 trees described. Now, this was from France. Now, what would it possibly explain this kind of phenomenon? Trees buried, standing upright, huge amounts of sediment. No, it takes something like a large flood, a catastrophic flood, to deposit sediments which bury a forest and cover the trees, and then to have these sediments form into rock rapidly in order to preserve the detail that we see in these trees, as well as at the top and as at the bottom. I think that's an excellent description, an estimate of what happened, and fits best with the evidence. A beautiful example of this phenomenon is seen near Cookeville, Tennessee, in the coal measures there. This tree standing upright in the sediment actually extends through two cyclotherms. A cyclotherm is a series of 10 different rock units where we find coal forming. And this sequence, the series of 10 rock units, repeats some 50 to 100 times. Trying to explain these cyclical deposits by normal uniformitarian processes gets very entertaining. Dr. Patton says, I think the tidal forces of a huge flood are much better at explaining the cyclic forces. But if we look at the picture and notice that we've got coal down there near the bottom that extends through numbers of layers up into another layer of coal above, what we're seeing there is a picture that demonstrates that you can't form coal over hundreds of thousands of years. It has to be basically a catastrophic event that deposits this sediment and covers it and forms it into rock rapidly, or you don't get this kind of picture with the tree standing upright and well preserved from top to bottom in it. Excuse me. Gotta get a drink of water here. Actually, that's better. Experiments with the formation of coal show, contrary to what we read and hear continuously, does not take a long period of time to form. Consider the quotation from Chemtech several years ago, giving the results of an experiment where a fellow for years and years to form coal in the laboratory and couldn't get it to happen. He says the reason is that he assumed it took a long time, but rather accidentally he found out that he could do that if he had done it rapidly. He says a rather startling and serendipitous discovery resulted. These observations suggest that in their formation, high-rank coals were probably subjected to high pressure at some stage in their history. A possible mechanism for formation of these high-rank coals could have been a short-time rapid heating event, maybe 6 hours. Now, George Hill, Mines and Mineral Industry College, wrote in Chemtech, by short time, he relates in the article, he's taking about 6 hours. With temperature and pressure, you can get coal formed from wood in just a few hours. And it doesn't happen slowly. Of course, you study the strata, the environment in which the coal is formed, and you will learn that from the trees and form, minute details and beautifully preserved fossils, the same kind of picture is seen when we experiment with the formation of oil. Notice the quotation from Sentinel Star down in Orlando, Florida. We're doing this at Texas A&M, by the way. And this was reporting from an experiment in London where we are told British scientists claim to have invented a way to turn household garbage into oil suitable for home heating and power plant use. And we're told here that we are doing it in 10 minutes, what has taken nature 150 million years to do, really. So this is what Noel McAuliffe said of Manchester University's Institute of Science and Technology. They won't still break away and observe and report what they see. The article goes on to say that the oil is comparable in quality to Middle Eastern crude. 10 minutes, but it took nature 150 million years? Of course, nobody sat around and watched